So the example we're going to be looking at in this video is consider the following investment. Invest 70,000 Rand now and expect risk-free returns in 2 years' time of 50,000. And then 3 years after that, expect 58,000 Rand return. The bank is going to offer 8.5% per annum compounded monthly. So in this video, we're going to use our financial calculator to work out the NPV, the net present value, and the IRR, the internal return rate, because those are the two options we can use to actually make a decision on whether we want to invest in the project or the investment versus whether we just want to put our money in the bank. So we're going to look at the NPV and the IRR, and we're looking at just putting it into our financial calculator. Just a quick reminder about how we interpret the NPV and the IRR. So for the NPV, if it is greater than 0, we accept the investment. Why? Because it's telling us that we would have to put more money into the bank to get the exact same return as the investment. So if we have to put more money into the bank to get the exact same return, we would prefer to use or to invest in the investment. And if the NPV is less than 0, we reject the investment for the exact same reasons as we discussed about the accepting. Then we have the IRR. And the IRR, we actually compare the internal return rate with the bank's interest. So if the internal return rate is greater than the bank's So if the internal return rate of the project is greater than the bank's interest rate, and we're comparing them with the same information, equivalent interest rates, particularly the annual effective interest rate. So just a reminder, this needs to be as an annual effective interest rate. And if we compare them and the IRR is greater than the I, we accept the project, because that's pretty much telling us that we will get more money from the investment than we would from the bank because the interest rate is higher. And if the IRR is less than I, we reject the investment. Okay, so one more time, we're going to do this on the financial calculator to determine whether we want to invest in the investment or the project versus just putting the money in the bank. We look at the NPV, which is the net present value. So we're going to look at the NPV and how to put it on our calculator and solve it. And a reminder of how do we interpret it. If the NPV is greater than 0, we accept the investment because it's telling us that we would have to actually put more money into the bank to get the exact same return as the investment. Then we look at the IRR and the methods of putting it into the financial calculator. And how do we interpret it? Well, we say the internal return rate is the annual effective interest rate of basically the project. So the annual compounded interest rate of the project, if you weren't looking at it with lump sums. And you're going to compare that with the bank's interest rate, convert it to the annual effective interest rate. So you'll obviously use equivalent interest rates to make your comparisons. And if your internal return rate is greater than your bank's interest rate, you're getting more money from your investment than you are from your bank. So you accept your investment. Right, so that's what this video is going to go through. So let's start with the NPV. So once again, we're going to invest 70,000 Rand at T0. So let's write that down on our timeline. So whenever we do this, we set up a timeline because we have to input the data into our calculator. So we say, okay, at T0, we invest 70,000. And then they say in 2 years, we get 50,000 Rand back. So we have T1 and then we have T2. And we have a positive 50,000. Then 3 years after that, we get 58,000 Rand back. So we have 1, 2, 3, T3. and we get 58,000 Rand back. Now, that's not T3, that is technically 2 plus 3, because remember, 3 years after 2 years. So in total, that is going to be T5. So let's just rub out all of this here and update it to T5. Okay, so that is our timeline. But what we're going to have to do is we're just going to have to fill in for all the in-between periods, because when we put it into our calculator, we need data for every single year up until when we stop. So for T1, for T3, and for T4, we're just going to put zeros down because nothing is happening in there. But we do need to input that data into our calculator. So the data table that we're going to be inputting into our calculator is it's going to be in order, and it'll be like, okay, for the 0 data point, we're going to have the minus 70,000. For data point 1, we're going to have 0. For data point 2, we're going to have 50,000. For data point 3 and 4, we're going to have 0 and 0. And then for data point 5, we're going to have 58,000. So that's what we're going to be inputting into our financial calculator when we're doing the working out. Now, one other thing we need to do before we go ahead and actually start, calculating things is we need to consider the fact that when we're making all our comparisons and when we're inputting our data, the bank's interest rate needs to be in terms of I1, so the annual effective interest rate. So whenever we input and use it in our financial calculator, it must be the annual effective interest rate. Or you could also see it as the normal interest rate, but per annum compounded annually. So we wanted to match the time period. So our time periods were in years. We need our interest to be represented in the same time period as our investments when we invest in. So we need to first convert it to I1, or the annual effective interest rate. So let's do that first and store it into our calculator. So the recipe for doing the conversion from nominal interest, which is what we have here, to the annual effective interest rate, and we can do this on our calculator, is we put M, the XY button, then we put in our nominal interest rate, and then we say second function to activate the EFF button. And that's going to give us our annual effective interest rate. So what would we input on our financial calculator for this is it's compounded monthly at the moment. So we put 12, XY, the 8.5, and then we say second function EFF, which is the PV button usually. The EFF will be above it in orange. And then we're going to just store this value. So we need it for our calculation, so we're just going to store it. So we're just going to store it in whatever variable we're comfortable with, AMRT. I just use variable A. Now we have everything we need for our calculations of NPV and our calculations of IRR. So at this moment in time, we have everything we need for NPV and IRR. Now I'm going to start splitting it up so you can see the differences between the two of them. Okay, so all I've done right now is I've just rewritten all the information on the screen that we need to do our working out. If you're still confused, just skip back in the video to see how we got all this information. But the idea is we had the timeline. We just made the timeline into a table so it's easier for us to read. You don't have to do that. You can do one or the other. And then we worked out the bank's interest rate as an annual effective interest rate. So we worked that out and we've stored it into the calculator into variable A. So we're always going to need the bank's annual effective interest rate. And we're always going to need our data table. And now we're going to work out what the NPV is on our financial calculator. So we're first going to go through the recipe, and then we're going to go discuss how to put it all in your financial calculator. And when I do it in the financial calculator, I will also do this working out when I discuss it. Okay, so the recipe is we always clear our information so that we don't have any artifacts from our previous calculation. So second function CA, but we're also going to clear our data tables. So this kind of information that is sitting on our calculator by pushing the CFI button and then saying second function CA. So that's always our stage one process of clearing our memory of the previous calculations. Then we're going to enter our data table. So we're just going to input the data table that is sitting over here. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to put in minus 70,000. So the plus minus button, 70,000, and enter. Then the next one is 0. So we say 0 and enter. Then the next one is 50,000. So we say 50,000 and enter. Now we could say 0 and enter, and then 0 and enter. Alternatively, we can actually make this a little bit quicker for us and use the fact that we could say 0, the XY button, to say it features twice in a row, and then push enter. So we can shorten that part there. But the idea is we're just putting down the table into our financial calculator so that it can do the working out for us. Then we have the 58,000. So 58,000 and enter. So we now have our data table, which is part 2, on our financial calculator. Next up is we're going to activate the menu to allow us to work out the NPV and the internal return rate. It's the same menu for both of them. So we're going to say second function, and then the CFI to activate that cash button, because that's going to bring up the menu that we're interested in. And now on our screen, and let's just write this in a different color. So on our screen, it's going to display the rate IY is equal to 0. Now, if we're working out the NPV, we're going to update this rate with the bank's interest and the annual effective interest rate of the bank. So we will put down, when it's displaying, we're going to say, okay, recall wherever we stored our annual effective interest rate of the bank. So I stored it in variable A, so I'm recalling by pushing the AMRT button, and then I'm going to push enter. So it's going to update the rate IY with the bank's annual effective interest rate. So it's going to display on the screen now as rate IY is equal to 8.84. Then we are going to push the down arrow to get the NPV showing up. So we're going to push the down arrow, and then on our screen, it's going to show the net PV is equal to 0. And we're just going to say, okay, update this value by pushing the compute button. And if you push the compute button, it is going to give us the net PV of 10,184.02. Now we can just recognize the fact that the NPV is positive. It's a greater than 0. So we are going to accept the project or the investment, because we would have to invest an additional 10,184 Rand and 2 cents into the bank to get the same returns as the investment / project. Okay, so let's just move our recipe and minimize it a bit so you can see the whole thing on our screen. And now we're going to go through it on our financial calculators so you can actually see me put in all the buttons. so you can familiarize yourself with the process. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to convert the bank's nominal interest rate to the annual effective interest rate and store that on our calculator. So we have the nominal interest rate is 8.5% per annum compounded monthly. So we're going to say 12, the XY button, the 8.5, and then second function EFF. So we have the 8.84, and we're going to store it in our calculator. So we're just going to say store into variable A, for example. Now, once we've done that, so once we've sorted out and made sure that our bank's interest rate is in the annual effective interest rate, we can move on to the actual calculations for the NPV or the IRR. In this case, it's the NPV. So now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that there's no artifacts of previous calculations. So we're going to clear the memories. So we're going to say second function CA. We're also going to say CFI second function CA. So we're just clearing the data tables and making sure the data tables are cleared. In my case, they were cleared because nothing came up on my screen when I pushed CFI, but still do it anyway, just get into that habit of making sure that it's being cleared. Now we have everything is sorted and we can start our calculation. So now we input our data table. So to input our data table, we invest 70,000. So it's minus 70, 1, 2, 3, enter. Year 1 has nothing in it, so we say 0 and enter. Year 2 has 50, 1, 2, 3, so 50,000. We push enter. Now we have 0 showing up twice, so we're going to do the quicker method of doing it. So we're going to say 0, the XY button, and it features twice, and then we say enter. Then we're going to get 58,000 Rand back next. So we say 58, 1, 2, 3, so 58,000, and enter. So now we've put everything into our data tables. Now we're going to open up the cash flow investment menu. So we want the cash to open up, so the cash menu. So we're going to say second function, the CFI button, because the cash sits above it. Now you see the rate IY sits here. And it's actually even telling you that you can either enter or compute it. So if we want to compute the net PV, we are going to update this rate IY with the bank's annual effective interest rate. But if you push down, because it does say that you can push down in this menu, you see the net PV is equal to 0. So we could leave the net PV is equal to 0 and ask the rate IY to compute. That's what we do for the IRR, which we'll be discussing next. But we're going to ask for it to compute the net PV. So you can actually see there's just the compute button there. So it kind of tells you what you can do with the menu if you just read the finer details on your display screen. So if you push up, you can either ask it to compute it or you can enter a value. When you enter the value, you are entering the bank's effective interest rate, annual effective interest rate, so that you can work out the next aspect of the menu, which is the net PV. So we're going to update this rate IY. We're going to update it with that value we stored in our calculator earlier. So we're going to say recall A and enter. So now we've updated it to 8.84, the bank's annual effective interest rate. Now we can push down on our menu and we can now compute the PV, the net PV, the NPV. So we'll just say compute. And now we get the net PV as 10184.02. And it is greater than 0, so we accept our investment. So just a quick recap. We have that the NPV is equal to 10,184 Rand and 2 cents. That means our NPV is greater than 0, and therefore we accept the investment. So we will invest in the project or the investment. Okay, so now we're going to work out the IRR. And what we've done here is we've just copied and pasted all the data we discussed, where we need to have the bank's annual effective interest rate. So we already made the comparison, or we already made the conversion to the bank's annual effective interest rate. And we've stored it in variable A, and we have our data table. If you're confused on how to get the bank's interest rate as the annual effective interest rate, I will go through it again when we bring up the financial calculator on the screen. But right now, we just want to acknowledge that it is sitting here as 8.84%, and we're going to need it for the comparisons. Okay. Now we're going to just work out our IRR. So we're just going to create a recipe that we put into our financial calculator to determine our IRR. So step 1, we just clearing our artifact information from previous calculations. So second function CA. We also need to clear the data table. So we're going to need to clear out our data table. So we're going to say CFI, second function CA. Okay, so stage 1, we clear our information. Stage 2, we're going to input our data tables. So it's going to be plus minus 70,000 and enter. Then it's going to be 0 and enter. Then it's going to be 50,000 and enter. Then it's going to be 0 and enter and 0 and enter. Alternatively, you could have actually just said 0, the X, Y, how many times 0 features in a row, 2, and then enter. Then we're going to input our 58,000 and enter. So we've entered our data table. So it's exactly the same as when we're working out the NPV. We put down the exact same information into the calculator up until this point. We're also now going to activate our menu, our cash flow investment menu. So we're going to say second function CFI so that we can get the cash button. And now on our screen, it's going to display the rate IY equal to 0. Now, this is where it differs from when you work out our NPV. So when you work out our NPV, we update this with the bank's annual effective interest rate. If we wanted to calculate our internal rate of return, we are going to not update it. We are going to ask the calculator to compute. So we will just say compute. And then it's going to give us the internal rate of return of this investment. So it will then give us and display the IRR by saying the rate IY is equal to whatever value we get now. Now, that's the main difference. So for NPV, we actually put in the bank's interest rate here, and then we push down and we go to NPV and we compute NPV. For IRR, we update the rate, we ask it compute the rate IY, and we leave the net PV as equal to 0. So we don't even go down the menu to net PV. So let's go through it on the financial calculator so we can see the process and get the answer. So I'm just going to move the screen across so we see the recipe sitting in the corner, and then we can see the financial calculator on the other side. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in this example is we're actually going to convert the nominal interest rate, which is 8.5% per annum compounded monthly, to the annual effective interest rate. So to do that, we're just going to first second function CA, clear everything, and then we're going to take the fact that it just compounded monthly, so we're going to take M, which is 12, use the XY button, put in the 8.5, which is the nominal interest rate that we were given, and then we're going to say second function EFF to give us the annual effective interest rate. So EFF is the effective interest rate. So it's 8.84. And what we're going to do now is just going to store this value. So we're going to store it in A so that we have it when we actually, after we input our data, we have the amount to input by the IY part of the calculation. Then next up, we are going to go through and like CFI, second function CA to clear that. Second function CA to also do the clearance of everything else. Then we're going to put in our data, which is minus 70,000. Enter. 0, enter. 50, 1, 2, 3, enter. And 2 zeros, so 0, XY, 2, enter. You could say 0, enter, but we do it quickly with 0, XY, 2, enter. And then 58, 1, 2, 3, enter. And now we're going to say second function cash. And we want to compute our IY here. So previously we put in the IY value. Now we want to compute this IY value. So we push compute. And it says it's 13.31. So the IRR is 13.31. The I of the bank, and let's just recall A, is 8.84. So the IRR is greater than the I of the bank, and therefore the return of the project has a larger, percentage. So we accept the project. So it's going to give us more money for what we put into it. Okay, so the last little bit of discussion here is we're just going to write down what we had just spoken about. The fact that our IRR was 13.31% and our I was 8.84%. That means our IRR was greater than our I, and therefore we accept the investment. Okay, so this is just a reminder about the process and how we would actually explain why we would want to accept the investment. Just spoken about.